evening of June 4th had been warm and clear in Washington. The president retired just before midnight to the family living quarters in the White House after the state reception for a visiting guest. But his rest that night was cut short by a message from Presidential Assistant Walt Rostow. At 3:30 a.m., the president was awakened with the news that Senator Robert Kennedy, in the midst of victory in the California presidential primary, had been shot and critically wounded by an assassin. The president's reaction to this shocking event was immediate. He ordered Secret Service protection for the major presidential candidates, dispatched a plane with special medical assistance to Los Angeles, and later in the day went on nationwide television to announce the appointment of a commission to study the climate of violence and extremism in America.
200 million Americans did not strike down Robert Kennedy last night, any more than they struck down President John F. Kennedy in 1963, or Dr. Martin Luther King in April of this year. But those awful events give us ample warning that in a climate of extremism, of disrespect for law, of contempt for the rights of others, violence may bring down the very best among us. And a nation that tolerates violence in any form cannot expect to be able to confine it to just minor outbursts. For this reason, I am appointing, with the recommendation of the leadership of the Congress, with whom I have talked this evening, a commission of most distinguished Americans to immediately examine this tragic phenomenon.
Early the next morning, June 6th, Robert Kennedy died, his death coming just 4.5 years after the assassination of his brother and only 2 months after the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King cast another dark shadow of grief across America.
During his life, he knew far more than his share of personal tragedy. Yet he never abandoned his faith in America. He never lost his confidence in the spiritual strength of ordinary men and women. He believed in the capacity of the young for excellence and in the right of the old and the poor to a life of dignity. Our public life is diminished by his loss.
At Arlington National Cemetery, along with the Kennedy family, President and Mrs. Johnson paid their last respects to the junior senator from New York at the place where he was laid to rest forever. Out of this tragic and brutal slaying, the president became even more determined than ever to turn heartbreak into constructive action. The day of the senator's death, President Johnson sent letters to the President of the Senate and the Speaker of the House, which urgently implored Congress to enact a meaningful and effective gun control law.
What in the name of conscience will it take to pass a truly effective gun control law? This hour of tragedy, that question should at last be answered. let us now spell out our grief in constructive action.
During the month of June, as he had done throughout the entire period of his incumbency, the President continued to urge members of Congress to stop the senseless criminal violence resulting from easy access to guns. On June 10th, the President convened the National Commission on the Causes and Prevention of Violence. Gathered in the East Room, the special panel, which would come to be known as the Eisenhower Commission after its chairman, Dr. Milton Eisenhower, included members from a cross-section of American life: church, government, education, and labor.
And my charge to you is simple and direct. I ask you to undertake a penetrating search for the causes and the prevention of violence. A search into our national life, our past as well as our present, our traditions as well as our institutions, our culture, our customs, and our laws. I hope your search will yield first an understanding and an insight into the kinds of violent aberrations which have struck down public figures and private citizens alike. Second, I hope your search will uncover the causes of disrespect for law and order, disrespect for proper authority in the home, and disrespect for public officials, and of violent disruptions of public order by individuals and groups. Third, I hope your search will lead to sensible and practical actions to control or prevent these outbreaks of violence.
Helping to curb this violence will be a bill President Johnson signed into law in June. The Safe Streets Act of 1968 is the first major legislation ever passed that confronts the problems of crime in America on a national scale. The heart of the bill was the President's request for measures to strengthen local police and law enforcement agencies across the country. During June, there were 3 ceremonies which highlighted the emphasis on excellence that both the President and First Lady have sought to bring out in 2 facets of American life: education and environment. First, President Johnson greeted the presidential scholars.
Because the honor that your nation pays you today is not just a reward for past achievement. It is a way of recognizing your special talents and expressing the confidence of the country in you. And we want in return for you to express confidence in your country and try to provide ability to lead and to return your great gifts to the country that has given you so much.
The Presidential Scholars Program was established by President Johnson in 1964 to recognize and encourage intellectual attainments among America's young people. The scholars are outstanding secondary school graduates who gathered in Washington on June 10th as guests of President and Mrs. Johnson. After a full day of meetings with government officials, they attended a reception in their honor at the White House. The President expanded on the theme of youth's responsibilities to the nation at a gathering of delegates to the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association's Youth Conference.
You have your obligation to your parents, to your teachers, to your principals, but you also have a very strong, compelling obligation to your country. If we are going to survive as a free nation, if we're going to have the liberty and independence and the freedom that we want, if we're going to have the opportunity, the prosperity, and the jobs and the housing and the beautification, all the things that we like and that we want, we're going to have first qualified leaders, and you can't find better talent to work on than you young people who come from rural America.
This month, the president followed through on a promise he made to the nation's young people. In June, he sent to Congress a message asking that the vote be given to 18-year-olds. As part of her beautification campaign, the First Lady paid tribute to local projects that have improved the face of the nation's capital.
Yesterday, I drove around the town for about 2 or 3 hours because I wanted to see the accomplishments at first hand, and I was delighted with the variety and extent of your efforts. Some of you have cleared vacant littered lots to provide much-needed recreation space in your neighborhoods. Others have cleaned up and planted their places of business or their own front yards. Some of those places of business were service stations and one a warehouse. They brightened them with shrubs and flowers.
There had been lively competition among residents of the District of Columbia for this year's Beautification Awards. Schools, civic associations, and business owners won most of the recognition. During June, President Johnson returned to the scene of one of his most dramatic conferences. In a commencement address at Glassboro State College, the president cited the progress made in Soviet-American relations in the years since his talks with Premier Kosygin at Hollybush, and expressed his optimism that further cooperation would be forthcoming.
I'm glad to return to Glassboro. I shall always remember this town as a place of warm friendship and hospitable people. The world will remember Glassboro, I hope, as a place where understanding between nations was advanced by the United States and the Soviet Union. It was last June, about a year ago, that Chairman Kosygin and I sat down in President Robeson's living room for 2 days of discussions. Our talks ranged over the whole globe. The year since then has been eventful and uncertain, like the age that we live in. But hope and achievement are certainly there to see, and our relations with the Soviet Union offer an example. Many feared that the war in Vietnam would prevent any progress. Many predictions were made to this effect. But despite the predictions and despite the difficulties, we have agreed upon a treaty outlawing armaments in outer space. We have negotiated a treaty banning the spread of nuclear weapons. We have achieved a civil air agreement that permits Soviet Union planes to land in the United States, and United States planes to land in the Soviet Union. And we're also moving toward other agreements.
I would like to conclude my brief remarks by expressing the hope that relations between our countries will develop in the interest of our peoples and of the improvement of the international situation in the world. And just speaking commercially, just to reciprocate the Secretary asked, I do invite all of you to visit my country and to see it for yourself and enjoy the protection you will get from this convention. Thank you.
One step that brought the United States and the Soviet Union closer together was the Consular Pact, signed at the White House in June. Historically, it was the first bilateral treaty between the two nations, the culmination of diplomatic exchanges begun 35 years before. An even more important advancement toward mutual cooperation between the world's two major powers occurred at the United Nations when the General Assembly overwhelmingly approved the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Both the United States and the Soviet Union had worked long and hard to secure its acceptance. Paying a surprise visit to UN headquarters in New York, President Johnson, appearing before that body for the 4th time, hailed the passage of this measure as the most significant step toward peace in United Nations history.
It is the most important international agreement in the field of disarmament since the nuclear age began. It goes far to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. It will ensure the equitable sharing of the peaceful uses of nuclear energy for the benefit of all nations. As regards the treaty itself, no time should be lost in bringing it into force. And I pledge you this afternoon that we of the United States will move rapidly to open the treaty for signature.
In recognition for his leadership and dedication in bringing about the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, President Johnson was presented the Swords into Plowshares Award by New York industrialist Stanley B. Roboff. The president kept his word to move speedily toward American approval of the treaty, which would be signed by the United States, the Soviet Union, and 55 other nations on the first day of the following month. Ratification of this treaty would await Senate approval. The award, a statue of the biblical prophet Isaiah, is made for contributions to the peaceful use of atomic energy. June was a month when two distinguished heads of state paid calls on the White House. President Johnson welcomed Costa Rican President Jose Joaquin Trejos Fernandez as the leader of a country which, through its own efforts, is helping to make the Alliance for Progress succeed. The warm greeting President Johnson extended to his guest symbolized the high regard with which he views the countries of Latin America. Later in the day, President Johnson was able to combine President Trejos' visit with a second gesture of friendship toward Latin America. In an elaborate East Room ceremony complete with charts and graphs, the president signed an authorization of U.S. support for a $1 billion increase in the capital funds of the Inter-American Development Bank. The president noted that during his period in office, the bank's resources have climbed from $1.4 billion to $6 billion. Also visiting the White House in June was the Shah of Iran. An official state dinner was held in his honor. In June, much of the president's attention was centered on the Paris peace talks. Early in the month, U.S. negotiator Cyrus Vance returned to Washington to report on an apparent impasse at those meetings. Vance could, however, relate to the president some slight indications of progress, particularly with regard to a softening of the North Vietnamese denial that they had regular Army units fighting in the South. From Vietnam, however, the reports were far from optimistic. Instead of a slowdown in hostilities as a result of the peace negotiations, the communists had launched a massive new wave of assaults throughout the South to erode resolve on the home front and grasp heightened leverage in the diplomatic struggle. Later in the month, U.S. Chief Negotiator Averell Harriman arrived in Washington for further discussions with the president. After weeks of communist intransigence, the United States position continued to show both firmness and flexibility. The United States would stop its air raids over the panhandle of North Vietnam, where supply and infiltration routes converged into the South, when a reciprocal gesture of de-escalation, either directly or de facto, was apparent from the other side. Meanwhile, the United States continued to seek peace in Vietnam through every other available channel. Working toward this goal would be the new U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, George Ball. Replacing Arthur Goldberg, who was retiring, Ambassador Ball was praised by the president for past service to his country and charged with the new task of funneling the hope, aspirations, and promise of independent nations into mutually beneficial cooperation. Through the month, President Johnson continued to meet with the major presidential candidates for intelligence briefings on problems confronting the nation. With New York's Governor Nelson Rockefeller, the president covered Vietnam, the economy, and domestic programs. Secretary of State Dean Rusk reviewed the diplomatic front, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Earl Wheeler, discussed the military situation. Also arriving at the White House in June for a conference with the president was Minnesota's Senator Eugene McCarthy. One of the issues that received top priority during these briefings had been the necessity for a tax increase. After much delay, the long-awaited bill was finally cleared by Congress on June 21st. As passed, it called for a 10% surcharge on corporate and individual income taxes and a $6 billion reduction in federal expenditures. Given America's needs, the large spending cut was a difficult trade-off to make. But the tax increase was an economic necessity. And on June 28th, in the Rose Garden, where he often has lunch and works, the President, without formal ceremony, signed the measure into law. There was a different Rose Garden event in June that involved another type of increase. Patrick Lyndon Nugent, the President's grandson, had reached his first plateau, the magic age of 1. Later in the day, there was a party in the White House Oval Room for President Johnson's Vice President in charge of happiness. In June, the First Lady traveled to Portland, Oregon, along with Secretary of Agriculture Orville Freeman, to deliver a lecture before a convention of the American Institute of Architects. Mrs. Johnson called for a new conservation that is concerned with the entire community to solve the problems of growing urbanization.
The answers cannot be found in piecemeal reform. The job really requires thoughtful interrelation of the whole environment, not only in buildings, but parks, not only parks, but highways, not only highways, but open spaces and green belts. But beautification, to my mind, is far more than a matter of cosmetics. To me, it describes the whole effort to bring the natural world and the man-made world into harmony, to bring order, usefulness, delight to our whole environment. And that, of course, only begins with trees and flowers and landscaping.
To boost the use and enjoyment of wilderness areas and parks, Mrs. Johnson viewed demonstrations of how a family can have an inexpensive vacation in such places, taking all of their needs with them. Later, the First Lady toured Timberline Lodge, built by WPA workers during the Roosevelt administration, and took a snowcat ride on wintry Mount Hood. A trip through the scenic Columbia River Gorge and a visit to a fish hatchery rounded out the two-day excursion before the First Lady's return to Washington. Spotlighting the benefits of the new conservation was one of President Johnson's aims when he traveled to Nashville, Tennessee, to dedicate the $50 million J. Percy Priest Dam. To the President, the dam was a perfect example of the new conservation because it preserves without polluting and brings nature and recreation within an easy day's drive of tens of thousands of people.
Our new conservation must build on a new principle, bringing nature closer to the people. That is not just my dream. It is happening. It is happening right here today in Tennessee. It is coming true all over this nation. When I took office, we were losing hundreds of thousands of acres every year to the bulldozers. Today, we are actually reclaiming more land than we're losing. That has been my goal since I became president. Along with peace in the world and progress at home, there is no legacy that I would rather leave than a permanent program of real conservation for this nation.
Back in Washington, a new drama was unfolding at the campsite of the Poor People's Campaign, Resurrection City. Originally conceived by Dr. Martin Luther King as a visible symbol of poverty in America, heavy rains and unrealistic demands brought mud and disaffection to what was supposed to have been a city of hope. The energies of its leadership were diverted from crusading against poverty to restraining militant agitators. During its existence, the Johnson administration kept a close watch over developments in Resurrection City. High government officials, including cabinet officers, held meetings with the demonstrators to listen to their grievances and try to work out solutions to many of their problems.
We're going to be leaving here very slowly. Right now, there are some...
On June 19th, more than 50,000 people gathered between the Washington and Lincoln monuments for a 9-hour peaceful demonstration of solidarity with the nation's poor. It was a capstone event of the Poor People's Campaign begun 2 months before.
Here to follow the absolute directions and the directives of the march.
But even as the voices of reason spoke nonviolence and restraint to this gathering, seeds of discontent were taking root in the camp itself. Tensions and discord continued until, after many arrests and increasing violence, it was finally decided by government officials to not extend for a second time the permit sanctioning Resurrection City. On June 24th, Park and District of Columbia Police began dismantling the wooden huts and lean-tos. When they left, the demonstrators had not achieved their immediate goals, but they had received a fair hearing from their government, even from a Congress reluctant to appropriate additional funds to poverty programs to whom they had addressed their major demands. At a news conference on June 26th, the President announced that Supreme Court Chief Justice Earl Warren was retiring. At the same time, he announced his nominations of Associate Justice Abe Fortas to become Chief Justice and Federal Judge Homer Thornberry as an Associate Justice. In making his third and fourth appointments to the High Court, the President knew that his choices would affect the destiny of the nation long after he himself had left office. He selected the men whom he considered best qualified to serve here. As June closed, the effort to win Senate confirmation began. For the President, the events of June were representative of situations he had faced throughout his term in office, containing elements of tragedy, controversy, accomplishments, disappointments, and some rare moments of joy. The emotions of this somber month, however, had left their mark deeply etched in the consciousness of both the President and the nation, where they would remain for a long time to come.